Right, good evening everyone. It is 6:30 and I welcome you to our lecture series, and tonight it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Martin, who is a Fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society and since 2006 has been Honorary Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Chiang Mai. A licentiate flautist, he did a sabbatical as Professor of Music in the University of Mahasarakham, and in his early career, he researched functional brain scanning in mood disorders in the UK and held a visiting chair at the University of Sunderland School of Sciences. He first researched the long 18th century whilst a Newcastle medical student with Professor Norman McCord under a George Henderson History Scholarship. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to make a few small points on housekeeping. That is, if you could keep your connection muted, and then at the end, I think Professor Martin will take questions, but if you could use the chat icon at the bottom of your screens, that would be very helpful. And then I will field the questions to Professor Martin once he's finished. So I'm going to hand over to you, Stephen, and we can now screen share. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to be with you virtually this evening, and always an honour to speak for the Royal Asiatic Society. What I'm going to talk about tonight is an extension of a painting which I used in a lecture a couple of years ago about Dr. Ferdinand de Jong, who was a Dutch East India Company doctor. And at that time, I was trying to find images of Western doctors practicing medicine in Asia, and there were very few. The painting, which is the focus of our talk tonight, is probably the earliest image of a doctor actually doing any practice, and it centres on Dr. Thomas Richardson Colledge and his painting by George Chinnery. But it's not just about Dr. Colledge, and I'll try and bring my PowerPoint up now. And I shall... and minimize that. There. This is Chinnery's painting of Colledge, and on Colledge's left is his assistant, and we know his name too. So really, we ought to be entitling the painting Portrait of Thomas Richardson Colledge and Athol, because we know that his assistant was a Portuguese Chinese man who helped him. I was able to publish a paper on the painting in Colledge early last year because, although it had already had some academic attention, we found that there was a brief biography of Colledge's daughter that had never been studied beyond a quick mention, and also made some interesting new observations about the painting. So, starting with Colledge himself, he was from Northamptonshire and went to Rugby School. He did a very brief spell of training in the Leicester Infirmary before formal medical schools, and really still in the aftermath of the Barber surgeons. There was no 5-year degree programme and formal registration. After that, he went to work with Sir Astley Cooper, who was a famous anatomist and surgeon in London and had a very good reputation. Astley Cooper's reputation was boosted even further when he removed a scalp pustule from George IV in 1821. He twice refused the operation because he was so scared that the king would end up with a serious and life-threatening infection. In 1817, at the age of 20, Astley Cooper advised Colledge that he should seriously look at going to work in the Far East. And through a friend of Colledge's, Sir George Best Robinson, Colledge was appointed as the civil surgeon to Macau. under the umbrella of the East India Company. His friend Robinson was head of trade in Canton at the time and later became head of trade for China. The short paper that we published last year is in Hectorn International Journal of Medical Humanities. But if you want to read it, it more or less parallels the talk tonight. And if you type in ophthalmology, College, Chinnery, it will come up straight away. At the time College landed in Macau, Portugal was renting it under Chinese sovereignty and had done so since 1557. That remained the state of play until 1887, when the Portuguese and Chinese signed a treaty, the Treaty of Peking, and it remained a perpetual colony until 1999. College was in China for 20 years, and he was there for so long that by the time he returned to Britain, the Anatomy Act 1832 had been passed, partly under Astley Cooper's management, and that had regulated dissection, and British society had expanded. So he went from Northamptonshire, Leicester and London and landed in Macau. This is a small oil painting by George Chinnery in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it's a helpful and atmospheric scene of a man cooking Chinese soup, serving it to customers at a table under an umbrella, or other people selling vegetables, and a busy street scene. So he's landing in a completely different atmosphere. I was going to play the DZ flute tonight, but unfortunately that's quarantined in Thailand. College's daughter Frances wrote her this short biography, and in it she explained how he developed his particular clinical interests. She said, not finding his civil surgeon's duties sufficient to occupy him, he started, with the help of friends, an ophthalmic hospital for the Chinese. So interesting and skillful were his operations there that he seems to have drawn of a morning admiring spectators among the company's writers who went to see old Tom College, as they called him, at his work. Such was the difference between modern and medicine in the British Regency era that the general public could dream of getting in to see operations. Francis Martin also tells us that College was very particular about keeping his manual dexterity sharp, and one thing that he used to do was avoid doing rough work with his hands. He wanted to keep his sensitivity for fine instrument use as carefully honed as possible, and he said that he did not even sharpen a pencil. That doesn't mean sharpening a pencil by turning it in a modern pencil sharpener, but he wouldn't have whittled it with a knife because it was such a coarse action. He was very careful and probably aware that if he used his hands in a rougher and more coarse fashion, he might have been at risk of losing his fine touch. The next character of interest in our story is College's wife, and this is Caroline Matilda Shillaber. She came from Salem in Massachusetts and was born in 1812. The reason that American families were going to China was because Salem had a quite considerable trade with the East Indies, and Salem sea captains exchanged coffee, spices, rice, and tin. And besides that, there seems to have been more of a proliferation of Americans in Macau than in Hong Kong, perhaps due to the dynamics of relationships with the British. She met College at her friend Harriet Low's in Macau, and they married in 1833. It was in 1833 that the two paintings were done by George Chinnery. This is Caroline at the harp with Colledge seated. It is a loosely painted canvas with brushwork that's been done with a lot less attention to detail, almost to the point of being unfinished looking, and that probably represented the personal budget of the colleges at the time that they had this painting done for themselves. But this particular canvas is now in the HSBC collection in Hong Kong. Their daughter, Frances Mary Colledge, who changed her name to Martin, wrote this biography that was published in 1880. It is only a few pages, but it is available on archive.org, so it's worth a read if you want to look at the subject further. And she wrote the short biography on her father's death. We don't know a lot about Frances. We know that quite typically the families who liked Asia and were used to living and working in Asia, they stayed there. She married a Bengal cavalry officer called Cunliffe Martin, and one of her sons also was a Bengal Lancer officer, and he died at Ajmer Rajputana in India on the 5th of October 1900, and that was documented in his 26th year of fever, contracted at the end of a year's arduous work in relieving famine. There seems to be something of a theme of philanthropy. That brings me to the character of George Chinnery. Chinnery was born in London in 1774, and he had a fair innings until 1852. The picture here is a self-portrait that he did in Macau around 1840. And if we look at that, we can see on his easel a painting of a Muslim domed tomb in India. So it appears that he's got out one of his sketchbooks, probably a pencil drawing, and he's doing a larger canvas of a subject of which he was particularly fond, the Islamic funeral architecture of Bengal and what's now Tamil Nadu. This is in the National Portrait Gallery. Note his spectacles, almost certainly having come at some time from college. Chinnery was very fond of putting his own paintings in his portraits. He's put two in his self-portrait, and they're typically townscapes on the walls behind the sitters. He was a very interesting character indeed. He was from a family where his father was an amateur painter, and he was a precocious talent. George Chinnery exhibited at the Royal Academy at the age of 17, and by the age of 20, studying with professional artists, though not the most famous, he was noted by an art critic to be rapid, almost beyond example. The word rapid, I think, is significant, and I'll come back to that. He was also described by critics as having a new style of painting, rather after the manner of Cosway. George Chinnery certainly copied Cosway's style of miniature painting, and sometimes it can be quite hard to tell the difference, but he rarely finished his backgrounds. When you look at the background of George Chinnery's early miniatures, they can look like anything from an Impressionist canvas to Marc Chagall. They are very abstract indeed, and it begs the question whether they were really unfinished or whether he was just letting his imagination run riot to the point that he left it. In any event, his miniature portraits were no doubt important for income. In the late 18th century, London was quite supersaturated with artists, musicians and composers, and it was very common that they had to migrate. They would go to the north of England, for example, William Herschel, or they would go to other parts of the country, go to Edinburgh, go to Dublin. Chinnery might have had Irish relatives. I don't think that's been established. One thing that I'm particularly interested in, with my old psychiatric hat on, is Chinnery's symptoms and how he behaved. And if we pull together the way his life panned out, I've put on this slide different examples of his behaviour patterns from different sources. two primary sources, two secondary sources, which are essentially reviews. So, first of all, Diane Foskett, in her book on British miniature portraits, she reviewed that he'd had these repeated episodes of vast overspending, restlessness, anger, and impulsivity. And one's first thought is that there is something the matter that's causing that to be so severe and disruptive and sustained. And then another phenomenal clue comes in from the old art historian Alan Carr, who said that he alternated into hypochondriasis and melancholia. In other words, he's having a cluster of behavioural symptoms which are excessive, and another cluster where he's going introspective and depressed. His friend and pupil, who worked for the East India Company, Sir Charles D'Oyley, described that he had chaotic living and obvious evidence that he lacked financial capacity. In Charles D'Oyley's poem about Tom Raw, a new recruit to the East India Company, he mentions Chinnery and says that the invoices just keep on running. In other words, he never paid his bills. He never paid his bills. And he was obviously a chap who had great difficulty controlling spending and also concentrating to be able to manage accounts. Harriet Low, who was a friend of Caroline Colledge, wrote a journal which was later published, and in that she talked about Chinnery having difficulty monitoring his habits, in other words, disinhibited, overeating but with no obesity, and that is a symptom of being hypomanic or manic, and constantly joking impotence. That too is a symptom of severe mania or less severe hypomania. You may come across the two different words. It's a bit like the Roman word hypocaust. Hypomania simply means a bit less severe, a smaller number of symptoms. Another very interesting factor from several accounts is that Chinnery was teetotal. He was avoiding alcohol. And we know that if you drink a lot, as alcohol wears off, it can exacerbate depression or exacerbate mania quite badly. And it seems that he was moderating his condition by avoiding alcohol. And that makes absolute sense. He seems quite moodily to have rejected Lam Qua, who was a Cantonese painter. He even denied that Lam Qua had ever been his pupil, when Lam Qua was categorical of that and very much copied Chinnery's style, including on occasions putting pictures in the background of portraits. One also wonders about an element of hypomania in Chinnery's creativity, with his very striking chiaroscuro to the point sometimes of being garish, or excess colour, again sometimes to the point of almost to the point of being garish. I think overall, if you put that story up to an audience of psychiatrists, they'd all be saying bipolar disorder. I think he probably had manic depression. And if we think more about his restlessness, his recklessness, and his overspending, in 1802 he left Dublin for Madras and he was accused of fraud. He got himself into monumental trouble, almost certainly as a manifestation of being reckless. In 1822, having already gone to Calcutta, he left for Serampore to escape arrest for debt. He also twice left his family and ended up estranged. Besides that, Chinnery was addicted to snuff. And we know snuff, tobacco products, contain nicotine. Now, if you look at the pharmacological chemistry of nicotine, it blocks dopamine, which is an excitation transmitter in the brain. And we know that mania is a disorder of dopamine regulation. So again, it looks very much like Chinnery had worked out how to self-medicate and to regulate his condition. And I think that's a very good explanation for his snuff addiction, again pointed out by Harriet Low. One never wants to be reductionist, but I think it's always good to blame the illness rather than blame the character, especially when Chinnery's mental health never impaired his art for long. Patrick Connor has described how his work would be as famous as that of Beechey or Lawrence, but for the fact that he was out in the Far East. My view is that if you look at the best of Chinnery's work, and much of his work is the best, if you look at it, it is of that quality. It's very individualistic. And I agree with Patrick Connor's view on that. And this is a painting that is in Tokyo, and it's quite an eccentric view. He's painted his back and almost a three-quarter profile from the back. It's very imaginative. There he is with his old spectacles on again. I think he's painted that in Macau, so it stayed in the Far East. There are three paintings of interest in the collection of the Royal Asiatic Society, and I'm going to start with the one that poses the intellectual challenge, a Brahmini bull. And I understand that Patrick Connor felt it wasn't by Chinnery. And this was presented by Richard Clark of the Civil Service in Madras in 1832 at a point, and I'm grateful to Alison for explaining this, at a point when the Society was inviting donations. And it appeared that he was very clear in saying it was by Chinnery. I understand Patrick Connor's view was that it's not because it's a very plain painting. However, there are points of interest. The stamp on the bull's hide is a temple stamp with a very bright red colour, and one of Chinnery's characteristics was to use quite a lot of vermilion, perhaps in his kind of excessive, elevated mood context. There's also this striking chiaroscuro of light and dark. This is an oil-on canvas. If we look in this slide at our index painting of Colledge, there's not a dissimilar block white colouring and very dark chiaroscuro. It's not subtle, and I don't think that's too dissimilar. Also, when we look at other pictures of cattle by Chinnery, in different media and different sizes, they're immensely variable. So perhaps the variability is not a strong reason for us to dismiss this as a Chinnery picture. We also have clues from some other drawings of how he noted block colouring. And all of the four pictures on screen of the drawing, the pencil drawing and colour wash, the watercolour, and a small oil painting detail, they're all by Chinnery. They all look quite different. And it does not, to my mind, exclude that as a Chinnery, and may be that we can still fairly say it's possible, even probable, given the time, place and person factors, that it's by Chinnery. I certainly don't think we can dismiss it. We've also got to keep respect for original descriptions when things are handed in just because they're not signed. It's too easy for us to say, well, it's not written down, therefore we can't accept it. I think we have to keep an open mind and keep analysing the factors with these interesting questions. There are two other watercolours in the Royal Asiatic Society collection. This is another of Chinnery's beloved views from India, a landscape view with a Muslim domed tomb, probably done around 1819 and in the West Bengal area. This is a small piece, 13 by 17 centimetres, and this was donated by Major General Charles Doyley, the chap who wrote the poem, including Chinnery and his massive financial difficulties. Another small watercolour in the collection is inscribed on the back, George Chinnery, 1819, and it shows another Muslim tomb. It has quite a Palladian feature to this. There's no pointing to the blind arch on the wall of the tomb facing the viewer, and also blind windows, so it's perhaps not a very late piece of architecture. These tombs were in India from the 13th century onwards. If you want to read about it, Shabir Leary and on the link there has done a nice piece on Muslim domed tombs. I did try and identify them. I've failed, unfortunately. There are several grander royal tombs that have survived. Even doing searches in Hindi, I couldn't identify the tombs in the two watercolours. There are several other examples by Chinnery, including some in the V&A and the Paul Mellon collection. Chinnery was a prolific drawer, and as well as doing his drawings, he often scribbled imaginary frontispieces as if he wanted to publish his drawings, and these are from his Macau years. This is a fishing boat with its sail and a characteristic basket roof. People would live under those basket roofs and even give birth in them as far as recently as the 19th century and early 20th century. Doctors described doing obstetric procedures on the boats under the basket roofs. Chinnery loved what he drew. Here's a piece of landscape with a sala outside Macau in a watercolour, and he liked his shore scenes in particular because Macau is a peninsula. There's one of the forts and one of the monasteries on the shore. This is the Indian picture of 1818 from which I took the cow with a cart and in a different orientation, some armed Indians. He painted with great sensitivity and beauty. In this drawing you can see some of his shorthand notes because he made observations about colours and dates or reminders. He seems to have been drawn to scenes of mothers with their babies in these cloth carrying harnesses and depicted it nicely and convincingly. And here is a scene of people smoking, weighing goods, selling things, preparing food, lots of different sketches on the same sheet. The shorthand here was translated by Conceição for an exhibition, and it actually reveals what Chinnery was thinking, because he said when he's doing his art, he particularly wanted, as he put it, to get the poetry out of the prose, and that's a phrase that Chinnery had used in other sheets of his drawings, to extract poetry from prose. That's what he wanted. He wanted something aesthetic. A rare pencil drawing shows some Europeans in Macau. They seem to be doing drawing practice or having a drawing lesson. On the left there's a pedestal table and a lady's holding up a board, and on the right the drawing is resting on a pile of books. This could be Harriet Low and Caroline Shilber, we don't know. He was particularly fond of animals and drew a lot of dogs with great sensitivity. I think they're quite wonderful. You can see the characters of the animals. The one in the middle there looks like he belonged to a Cantonese butcher. And I'm particularly fond of this group of goats, where he's perhaps drawn the same animal in different orientations and really enjoyed it. One of the characteristics of Chinnery is to draw chaotic squiggles when he's illustrating the edge of vegetation or a ground. You can see that a few times in this. That's from 1833. He did several drawings of people gambling. There's always a darkness to that. They always have a flexed posture and a sense of despair, dismay, leaning against the wall. You do wonder whether the depressive bouts within Chinnery gave him some kind of empathy to the potential misery of the gambling. One thing that is never touched upon is opium use. You like pigs, and interestingly, in the top left pig, his shorthand is a description of the block colouring if you wanted to paint it later on. Perhaps that's a bit of a clue to the thinking process in the Brahmini bull, if indeed that is by Chinnery. These drawings and watercolours come from Conceição's book, which was done in 1985 for an exhibition in Macau, and almost all the drawings I've shown you are from the Geographical Society of Lisbon, the watercolours from the Toyobunko Gallery in Tokyo. My personal view of Chinnery is that he had an energy and brilliance, that he was a prolific master of painting and drawing. We can see him as a visual geographer and historian who loved his subjects. And I've said when he sketched his frontispieces, there's a sense in that he wants to publish and he wants to share. He was a product of Georgian sensibility, the miniature painting market. He was certainly a product of the Enlightenment. There's a clarity of thinking behind his paintings. And I do touch a sense of sharing, learning and observing, particularly when he's clustering things together and wanting to put multiple and complex ideas onto the canvas. That's very much like the ideas of Zoffany, condensing many images and ideas and events, or the art of the late Dutch Republic with its multiple emblems and symbols. He was a Freemason, which did, of course, embody Enlightenment philosophy. And in recent years, I've worked on an extension of my earlier research as a doctor doing functional brain scanning in mental illness, and tried to answer the question, looking at how the human brain functioned in parameters of the Enlightenment philosophy, that is, clear thinking, sharing, openness, freedom from superstition, and a degree of faith. For example, in Freemasonry, you were encouraged to believe in any supreme being, it didn't matter who. And if you look at those parameters and then look at similar research in functional brain scanning, I think there is a very good chance that a philosophy can alter the way the brain plastically changes its tone and its function. And again, that's published in Hecton International Journal of Medical Humanities, if anybody wants to read more about it. And to summarise, I think Chinnery can be seen as a stylistic time capsule of Enlightenment richness, whilst back in Europe, under Sir Thomas Lawrence, everyone's doing the swagger portraits. There's no emblematization of weapons or scepters in Chinnery. He's much more of an Enlightenment man, perhaps due to his Asian isolation, where he's found his niche. And this is a drawing of George Chinnery dancing. This was sketched by his friend Sir Charles Doyley. I think he's got a wonderfully energetic expression on his face and really not bothered what he looks like. That brings me to our index painting for this talk. I'm calling it Afon and Thomas Richardson College in the Macau Eye Hospital. You think about the elements in the painting. Top right, there's one of Chinnery's canvases, almost certainly in the background. You can see there's a ship, it's a shore scene, and there's a typical Cantonese house with a chamfered corner. And the corners are cut off those buildings at 45 degrees. There are a lot in Bangkok. You see them anywhere there are Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, to prevent accidents with carts coming round corners. We look at the top left, there's a monsoon brewing, and there's a great drama and light contrast in the picture. The last shaft of sunlight is there before the thunderclouds open. You can feel the electric tension in the air before a monsoon storm. Banana leaves are blowing around. As you go down, just above the left arm of the patient, seated man, you can see a white line of the far shore of Macau's inner harbour. The darkness in the left-hand side of the picture is in keeping with the man with a dirty bandage, as if there's a poor prognosis going on there from his eye procedure. And then this glorious white light in the centre, this chiaroscuro of costume and clinical practice. We know from Harriet Low that the patient had been blind and that Colledge had restored her sight. Colledge has got his fob seal on his watch chain. There's a lovely delicacy to the way Chinnery has painted the female patient's circular pink coral earrings, which match her lips and are similar to the finial on her parasol. Harriet Low described the boy as being the son of the patient. To Colledge's left is Afon. Again, we have Harriet Low and Francis Martin to thank us for naming Colledge's assistant, who was half Portuguese and half Cantonese. On the floor, under the table, bottom right, there is a leather volume dark brown. And on it, you can just make out the lion and unicorn and the shield. I wondered, was Chinnery trying to hide away the darker aspects of the EIC under the table in the dark? It seems a strange symbol, and one cannot help think, if he went to the time and effort of putting that in the canvas, is there not a message in it? That this perhaps is philanthropy, this is caring, this is constructive, but there are other darker things going on. It makes you think. He never painted opium. The opium wars were brewing. It's perhaps one of those paintings that raises as many questions as it answers. The painting was commissioned by the East India Company, not by Colledge, and they gave Chinnery a huge sum of £500. That was Sir Thomas Lawrence's kind of fee, up to his death in 1830. That was top whack. It is a very fine and detailed canvas and complete. It was probably done in 1833, and in 1834, evidently because the EIC wanted to distribute this image of integration and care, William Daniel made a print of it, and he entitled it Thomas Colledge, Esquire, member of the Royal College of Surgeons, London, and surgeon to the British factory in China, attending at his private ophthalmic infirmary in Macau. It stayed in the hands of an EIC employee, Charles Millett, who seems to have taken it back to England very quickly. But on his death, it was given to the Colledge family and stayed in the family, going to America, and eventually was donated to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, on the death of the donor. And I'll give a full credit to the Peabody Essex at the end of the talk. I think it probably is the earliest image of a Western doctor actually practicing medicine in Southeast or East Asia. And again, if you want to read a little bit more about it, I'd refer you to the Hector International article and other references. What struck me was that Colledge, with his hand on the patient's head gently, is directing her, and she is casting her gaze on the red document in the boy's hand. It seems to have a mixture of European and Cantonese characters. There's an A and a W, and then there are some characters in Chinese which I find hard to read. I think there's another stylized A further down. It appears that he is asking her perhaps to read the characters or to check a sight. Otherwise, I can't see why he'd be putting his hand on her head in that scene. I'm not certain, but when one bears in mind that Snellen invented eye charts in the Netherlands in 1862, there seems a very good possibility that with Affon's help, if these are Cantonese characters, Colledge and Affon are testing patients' sight with charts very early on. There's another explanation that red letters were used as thank you letters, but I find it hard to escape the scene that there's testing going on. When we look at the instrument case on the table, you can see in the middle of the open lid some odd-looking forceps like an X shape. They're called speculum forceps, and they're for holding eyelids open so that you can comfortably look at the eye and carry out procedures. And the patients are not going to be blinking. It's probably less distressing for the patient when the patient gets used to it. Also in the lid, there are scissors and other forceps. And then there are something like 10 or 15 ivory-handled instruments, which would be hooks, knives, spoons, needles. And here is such a set. This is owned by an American anaesthetist called Dr. Douglas Arpitia, who very kindly let me use his picture from his collection for this talk and for the Hecton article. And the label on this set is John Vyse, 62 The Strand, London. And we know from the trade directories they were there from 1836 to 1841. Prior to that, from 1787, they were trading in other places. And you can see the needles, the scissors, and the other instruments. It's even got the same velvet coloured lining. The ophthalmoscope is missing, but that's because it wasn't invented until 1851, which was a massive breakthrough in being able to discern a lot of clinical information on blood vessels and inflammation within the head, and damage to the retina from different causes. And that was a massive breakthrough, but it was not there when Colledge was in Macau. There is an image suggested to be the Macau Eye Hospital, which is this on the shore, and it may well be with a terrace. From 1844, having done some further training in England, Colledge and his family settled at Lauriston House in Cheltenham, which he bought, and it still stands today. It's now an office block, a very beautiful piece of architecture indeed, with these Egyptian-style capitals, sadly next to a roundabout and a load of traffic lights, not in a quiet suburb, but at least it's been preserved and looks beautiful. I'll say something about Harriet Low Hillard being a married name. She gave us this wonderful insight as a manifestation of her astute observations, her lively thinking, and very engaging writing. She had an immense talent, and it's thanks to the presence of her talent that she's given us some wonderful descriptions of Macau at the time. This is her portrait by Chinnery. You can see the inner harbour and the waves lapping on the shore again on the far side. Her journal was published as Lights and Shadows of a Macau Life, 1832 to 1834. And those papers are so important, they're now in the Library of Congress, the originals. She described in a book having a portrait done, and she said that she was wearing this dress with material stuffed up the sleeves, pillow material, and she was disconcerted by it. Harriet socialised a lot with Chinnery and with the Colledges, and she'd been a school friend of Caroline Shilber in Salem, Massachusetts. There are many descriptions of their dinners, afternoon tea, and conversation on the rocks. No doubt very intelligent conversation, a lot of the reflections of which went into her phenomenally illuminating book. She'd gone to Macau with her aunt and uncle from 1829 to 1834. Her uncle was William Henry Low, and he was the head of Russell and Company. He has a portrait done by Chinnery, and again, a Chinnery landscape hanging on the wall in the background. Russell and Company traded tea and silk, and later they ran the Shanghai Steam Navigation Company for 3 decades from the 1840s. Interestingly, the Lows were forced to leave in 1833. There was increasing opium trade going on, with the opium being grown in the Upper Ganges Valley and then exchanged in China for silver. The details of why need more investigation and begs a very interesting question. Was there any moral conscience issue going on with the opium? Also notable is that Harriet went back with Afon's son, Ayok, and he settled in Salem, Massachusetts. Sadly, William Low died on the journey home. A few snippets from Harriet Low. She said, "We had a dinner party consisting of Mr. and Mrs. Colledge, Mr. English, Bradford and Blight, all Americans but 2, which goes to illustrate the perhaps disproportionate American presence compared to Hong Kong." In a separate entry, she said, "Thought myself very busy this morning, but I was only touring round, as Aunt Orne used to say. Caroline came in about 1 and stayed till 3. So typically their afternoon. We did a great deal of talking and some sewing. After dinner, I went out in the chair. Met Colledge, said his wife had gone to the rocks. I went and joined her, and we sat there discussing the affairs. It wasn't just chat. They were thinking in depth about the whole social scene and what's going on." She talks about Chinnery. She said, "Went to Chinnery's this morning to have my own face painted. Sat there with all the patience I could muster from 11 till 3, in hopes it would be the last. But there is one more to come. The room is so hot that it is almost insupportable, not a breath of air allowed." She asked Chinnery, when he did the portrait of the hospital scene, if Afon in Colledge's picture could keep still enough to be painted. "Ma'am," he says, Chinnery says, "the Rock of Gibraltar is calf-fat jelly to him." He was also a restless fellow. He said, Afon considers it #1 good luck to be put in the picture. As I said, Harriet suggested that there was a chalk thank you letter, but the mixed characters and the gaze of the patient suggest a test card as well. And it was recorded in the journals that the patient in the painting was restored to sight from being totally blind. Interesting comment on the way Harriet thought about poverty. She said, "The China woman is just as well contented with her situation as we are with ours. And indeed, I am sometimes inclined to believe that she is to be envied when compared with a woman of fashion who is tortured with envy, malice, and uncharitableness." And she's getting her head around the very interesting relative dynamics of Eastern poverty and Western wealth. And it's still very topical today in terms of trying to define what parameters we should be using to look at what are real measures of wealth. And it strikes me when you're in villages in Southeast Asia today that there are people with 1,000 or 2,000 mean per capita gross domestic product, but they are very happy and well fed and well clothed and have wonderful societies where people with learning disabilities and mental illness integrate and work, and they manage their own crime largely. And these are matters for considerable flexibility of thinking in future, I think. Great credit to Harriet Low that she considered it. I did wonder when Colledge had come back to England in 1838 whether the Opium Wars had influenced that. That was the year he got his medical degree. He went to Edinburgh and Aberdeen and then came back down south. Why did he really migrate back? Well, there wasn't any violence in the Opium Wars, though tension was brewing. Chinnery stayed put throughout the First Opium War, when there were warships in and out of Macau, lots of tensions and blockades, lots of nasty rumours. It seems to have bounced off him. But sadly, the colleges had 3 sons die in succession. This is the monument in Macau, photographed by Chris Nelson. Thomas died at age 18 months, and to lose 3 is more than enough to think about displacement, such a stress that you wonder whether you really want to be staying there. Infant mortality was terrible. We don't know absolute figures for Macau, but we do for Hong Kong later in the century. And these were written by Dr. Francis Clark, who was a Durham graduate. He was the first medical officer of health in Hong Kong. And for 1895-96, he calculated Chinese infant mortality to be 680 per 1,000 live births. When he looked at the figures again, he corrected it to 759. More than 75% of children dying in the first year. Absolutely horrific. His figures for the European civilian community in Hong Kong, and this is 60 years post-Colledge, 116 per 1,000 were dying in infancy. And they cited tetany, convulsions, hygiene. It was basically infectious disease. And it was basically poor cleanliness around obstetrics and other infectious transmissible diseases. For the civilians, the overall figures at the time Colledge was there in the UK were in the late 1830s around 280 per 1,000, so about 1 in 4 died in infancy. It was less in the country and with good hygiene. It was a lot more in the bigger cities, which skewed the figure. And if you want to read more about that, there's a very good MA thesis by Petrie. The casualties of the Opium Wars were horrific and horrifically skewed in order to protect opium trade profits. There were about 18 to 20,000 Chinese killed, 520 British killed during Chinnery's lifetime and his stay in Macau, and far higher figures for the Second War. A lot of that was at sea, maybe why Chinnery was relatively unscathed. Francis Martin recorded that Colledge said the one good work of his life had been founding the medical mission in China. And the Medical Missionary Society in China, which he instigated, had 6 hospitals in Canton, Hong Kong, Macau, Amoy, which is Xiamen in Fujian, Ningpo, Ningbo in Zhejiang, and Shanghai. Canton continued to operate until the 20th century. Of Christians in China today, the official state figure is 3.1%. That's 44 million out of the 1.4 billion. There was a very nice, illuminating edition of the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society in January last year with a guest editor George Chinnery from the Hong Kong Baptist University, and that was about the Mandarin Union version of the Bible from 1919. But earlier, by Colledge's time, Marshman and Serenport produced a Chinese Bible, and Morrison had finished his work in Malacca on the Chinese version in 1823. There are contemporaneous references on what the Society was doing, particularly by Colledge's successor, Peter Parker, and a document written by Colledge and Parker together from 1838. On reading that, there was nothing of any medical content. It doesn't talk about clinical practice or numbers of patients. It doesn't talk about hospitals. It simply goes through the Christian ideals and matters of administration. Having said that, I think it may still be worthy of further academic attention. An interesting character associated with Colledge's successor was Lam Qua, and I've mentioned him before because Chinnery denied he'd ever been his pupil. Now, from the 1820s, he worked as really the first Western-style medical illustrator, but also a relatively prolific portrait artist in the manner of Chinnery. He was much more businesslike, and there's a super book by Giles Tillotson that explains that he was a much more astute businessman than Chinnery. 115 medical oil paintings survive, or that he did for Dr. Parker, including tumours on which Parker operated. Parker didn't just do eye work, he also did anaesthetics and tumour surgery, as I said. He was cheaper than Chinnery and much more dependable. So Dr. Peter Parker, in a portrait here by Lam Qua, went to Guangzhou and then Canton in 1834. He founded the Canton Eye Hospital. You can see in this painting, he too has a Weiss ophthalmic instrument box on the table, and the composition is very similar to Chinnery. He employed Lam Qua a lot, and after college, who mentored him, he succeeded as president of the Medical Missionary Society in China, and he was there for 24 years. Colledge and Parker were both there for similar lengths of time before returning. Parker became very famous, friend of Abraham Lincoln, and was well known. So, to come to some suggested further reading, Hoyle and Fu have particularly looked at the Christian aspect of the context of the hospital developments, and I do recommend this short but very interesting read by Frances Mary Martin about her father, which she published in 1880. Ravin had already done an article about Colledge, but because I was interested in some new observations of the painting and Frances Martin's description, I managed to get my work through blind review, thankfully. However, Ravin's account is still very helpful. On Lam Qua, I'd recommend reading Gilman and Stephen Rackman. And about Patrick Connor's 2 books on Chinnery. Alan Carr did a short but well-written and well-researched biography of Chinnery for a 1957 exhibition. And in John Carroll's Canton Days, British Life and Death in China, it is a very good read for a professional historian or for a general reader to get an extra feel for the dynamics of life then. And he did pick out an interesting phrase that imperial involvement wasn't a monolith, by which he meant it wasn't a homogeneity of nastiness. Both as a picture credit and as a recommended read, Giles Tillotson's book, Fan Quare Pictures, Hong Kong Bank Art Collection, is very well written. Giles wrote this when he was in his 20s. It's extraordinarily thorough and most illuminating. It's also beautifully photographed by Steve Wakeham, and I was very pleased indeed to have Fabian Rigby's support for this talk to be able to use the HSBC images, which was most kind of him. He also got back to me very quickly. Special thanks to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, who have never hesitated in me been able to use this for the podcast, for adverts, for the paper, for the talk, and they've been very nice indeed about it. It was actually Cecilia Colledge who had settled in America. She was an Olympic ice skater. She didn't have any children, and when her father, who was still a surgeon, died, she donated the painting to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. Thanks again to Dr. Abitier, and I just got the picture of Colledge's residence from Google Maps Street View. So, Frances Martin said of her father, Thomas Richardson Colledge, he was the most popular man with all classes out there. His one assistant was a half Chinese, half Portuguese named Afon, a Roman Catholic, and the best man, my father used to say, he ever knew. After Colledge's return to England, she said patients who'd known him in Macau even moved to live near him in Cheltenham. And when Colledge's family sailed out of Macau, she wrote, "Every European was on board ship to wish him bon voyage, and the sands and rocks around crowded with Chinese." My conclusions are that Colledge brought much needed ophthalmology to China and gained immense respect from Europeans and the Chinese. In turn, he thought very highly of his local assistant, Afon. Frances Mary Martin gave us a valuable insight. Harriet Low and Caroline Shillaber were pivots in a very different society structure to that of today. They have to be seen as social analysts, and Harriet has to be seen as writing that down. Caroline bore the horrific risks of motherhood. The influences before and after are remarkable. Colledge was free to travel to the Far East because the Napoleonic Wars had ended. After the Second Treaty of Paris of 1815, that was possible. Before then, there was no chance that his work, his founding of Western ophthalmology, Western medicine in China, could have happened at all. It had to be under the East India Company umbrella. And it's notable that he set up the hospital because he wanted to do philanthropy, and in the Christian framework, that kept ticking. I also think that bipolar disorder drove Chinnery to India and then to China, but I also think it kept him there. I think it kept him there because he adapted. He found his niche, he was self-medicating, he knew what to avoid, he was regarded as an eccentric, but he was also much loved, and Harriet Low was drawn to him. It did not harm Chinnery's sensitive, artistic genius. Luckily, because if that is not a master painting, I don't know what is.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll try and get back to...
You just need to stop sharing the screen.
Stop share, there we are.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. That was, and thank you for the wonderful array of Chinnery drawings, which I haven't seen actually.
Yes.
They're really so interesting. It gave me another perspective on the man. Right, now we're going to open the chat for questions now, but I will just start off with one. I just wondered if you might say something on Chinnery's end, the end of Chinnery. What happened to him?
Oh, he died of a stroke, and I think it was rather sad actually, because it was obvious he'd had a stroke in Macau. He was in Asia for around 50 years. It was quite an extraordinary duration. It was normal for people to go out and come back. Artists did not tend to die. It was as if they were mixing in a circle in India, where they were getting the right advice to cover up, to fill in the puddles. So artists were not dying in India. They were going out and they were coming back. If you look at the Dutch East India Company death rates, they were horrific. You could easily see in the mid-18th century a third of a ship's crew and passengers dying off the coast of West Africa, for example. And there was no overland, there was no Suez Canal. So that was very dangerous. The artists survived, so the likes of William Wales, Ozias Humphrey, the Daniels, they got back. But Chinnery was, I think, hiding. I think he was hiding from himself, from his terrible, devastating mental illness, which is really very obvious when you add everything up. But in the end, he appears to have had a major stroke, either a clot or a bleed in his brain. It would have been clinically obvious. Rather sadly, they decided to do a post-mortem. And what they found was that the stroke was proven. It was not necessary to do a post-mortem on old Chinnery. However, they were particularly interested in his stomach because he was famous for eating huge quantities of food. He could knock back his food, and they were always amazed that he never gained weight. And I think that's probably because of the amount of energy burned in his thinking and his physical activity. The reason I put that picture up of Chinnery dancing was because it so much conveys how much energy he had. There's no other picture of him moving, but you can see here's this old man, he's on the dance floor. And I think that tells us a lot about how he burned his energy off. So they were staggered that he had a normal stomach at post-mortem. It's a bit sad that they did it, but it's notable.
Right. Thank you. I was just seeing if there are any questions on the chat. We still haven't got any, but I have another one. Colledge, from what you've said, appeared to be an absolutely remarkable man and remarkable doctor in the way that he was admired. I just wondered about the impact of that painting of him, operating on the lady in Macau. I just wondered if you could say something more about that. I mean, has it been used as an image to promote, the hospitals or whatever?
It's certainly attracted a good deal of academic attention, and for a painting of that nature to have as many papers that are at least mentioning it is remarkable. It's not been used as a promotional thing. The Peabody Essex Museum are proud to have it, but I think the East India Company had a dynamic of wanting to promote something, and I do wonder whether when William Daniels being paid to make a print of it, that was a promotional drive to consider integration and philanthropy as an advert for what they were up to. It wasn't a good advert for multi-million opium trade, giving people severe mental illness and state-sponsored drug dealing, which is horrific. But it was quite remarkable and perhaps unique for the time that it's condensing philanthropy and racial integration in the working team, racial integration in caring for the patients. There's nothing else like it. So, and the detailed title of William Daniels' print is categorical that this is something that they want to advertise. They wouldn't have been doing that but for a drive to be seen to be doing some good. And it's this old dynamic again, that it's not homogeneous nastiness, and you have to have that strand within it. I think historians have to face empire full on and look at the aspects, and you have to do this kind of impartial description of what it was. But that is a very remarkable example. It's rare. It's never been used in modern promotion in anything. But at the time, it looks like it. There's no correspondence I've come across about Daniel working for the EIC, but it may be something would turn up.
I mean, was the print very widely distributed?
I don't know. It's rare. It's not the sort of thing where you're going to find 100 copies on eBay.
No.
It is rare. I think there are one or two galleries who do have copies, but it is rare. So perhaps it wasn't. Then again, there were things that were made in the hundreds, and it's not uncommon to have only one left. Like when, I'm just going to say, when Joseph Haydn was in England in 1809, the Wedgwood factory made a cameo of him, and they must have made hundreds, but because he was immensely popular when he was doing the London Symphony concerts, there's only 2 left.
And I was just wondering, because Macau at that time, as you said, was owned by the Portuguese. Were there any other Portuguese doctors there, or other medical you know, people that have been remembered in the same way that college has?
Not in that, not to that extent at all. The Portuguese would have had their own physicians, but that would have been in a military context. So the physicians in India were in a military context. We know in Batavia as well that the Dutch East India Company doctors would treat the public as a service. They're primarily there for their civil servants and the military. So no, there was no Portuguese Western medicine hospital, and the first Western hospital in China was the Macau Eye Hospital.
Okay. Right, well, we don't seem to have any questions on the chat, so I would just like to thank you very much, Stephen, for a really interesting talk. And I mean, it was just great to see all that Chinnery and of course our own 3 paintings that we have. He's certainly a very interesting man, and the painting, as you say, is unique, isn't it? It's just completely unique.
Yes,
I
I mean,
for calling our attention to it, and I enjoyed it very much, and I think everyone would agree with me. So I would like to say thank you to, someone has, there's a clap, somebody's clapping.
Thank you.
So a silent clap, that's very good. And that's very nice. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and I look forward to seeing you again at our next lecture. And if you're not signed up to our mailing list, then do contact us at, you know, the Royal Asiatic Society, info@royalasiaticsociety.org. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Right.